He was 32 years old when he died, and he had already conquered the largest empire the ancient world had ever seen. A world unified under one ruler, one language, one vision of human civilization, stretching from Greece to the ends of the earth. He never lost a single battle, and at the moment of his death, he was already planning his next great campaign of conquest. Alexander the Great died in Babylon in 323 BC, leaving behind a vast empire with no clear successor and no clear plan. His generals immediately began tearing his life's work apart, and within a generation, the greatest empire ever built had completely collapsed. But what if Alexander had not died that night in Babylon? What if he had recovered and continued his extraordinary campaign of conquest? This is the story of what might have been. What if Alexander the Great had lived another 20, 30, or 40 more years? Into stories was aleds. The consequences would have been almost impossible to imagine, touching technology, democracy, religion, science, and the fate of civilizations across the entire globe. This is what if Alexander the Great had lived longer, and the answer will change the way you see the ancient world forever. To understand what might have been, we must first understand what actually happened, and why Alexander's death was so catastrophic for the ancient world. When asked who should inherit his empire, Alexander reportedly whispered just 3 words: to the strongest. And those 3 words unleashed decades of war. Ptolemy took Egypt, Seleucus took Persia, Antigonus claimed Asia Minor, and Cassander seized Macedonia. The empire shattered almost immediately. The cause of his death remains one of history's greatest unsolved mysteries, from typhoid fever to poisoning by political enemies to the effects of battle wounds. But what if Alexander had simply recovered, as he had recovered from so many devastating battlefield wounds throughout his extraordinary military career? In our alternate timeline, Alexander recovers from his fever in Babylon, weakened but alive, and the experience changes him profoundly and permanently. Faced with his own mortality for the very first time, Alexander becomes more focused and more strategic than ever before in his life. He immediately addresses the succession question, formally naming his son Alexander IV as heir and establishing a clear regency council to govern. His recovery sends a powerful message across the entire empire. Alexander is not just a conqueror, he is a builder of worlds. In our alternate timeline, Alexander reorganizes his empire into a more sustainable administrative structure, drawing on Persian, Greek, and Macedonian traditions to create something entirely new. Tax collection is reformed, local governors given more autonomy, and the vast road network connecting the empire is expanded and dramatically improved. The political chaos of previous centuries is replaced by a new system of governance, something resembling a constitutional monarchy, where the emperor rules with Senate consent. Christianity continues to spread in our alternate timeline, but develops very differently. Without the political fragmentation that followed Rome's fall in our own world, the first century of survival is difficult, but Alexander's empire endures, and the greatest work of his life is still ahead. In our timeline, Alexander was actively planning a conquest of Arabia at the moment of his death. In our alternate timeline, this campaign goes ahead. Arabia in the ancient world was the crossroads of an extraordinarily lucrative trade network, connecting the Mediterranean world with India, East Africa, and beyond. Alexander's Arabian campaign is a brilliant success, achieved not through pure military conquest, but through a combination of forced diplomacy and strategic dealing with local rulers. With Arabia under his control, Alexander commands the most lucrative trade network in the ancient world. The wealth flowing in is almost beyond imagination. And Alexander, ever restless and ever ambitious, is already looking west toward the 2 great powers that dominate the Western Mediterranean world. This is where our alternate history becomes truly extraordinary. With the East secured and Arabia conquered, Alexander turns his full attention to the Western Mediterranean. Ancient sources actually record that Roman ambassadors visited Alexander in Babylon shortly before his death. suggesting Rome was already watching this extraordinary conqueror very closely. Rome, recognizing Alexander's overwhelming military superiority, would most likely have sought a diplomatic solution rather than military confrontation with the world's greatest conqueror. Carthage, the great North African trading empire controlling the western Mediterranean routes that Alexander coveted, presents a very different challenge, requiring a very different response. A conflict between Alexander and Carthage is inevitable, and given Alexander's unbroken military record, the outcome of that conflict seems equally inevitable. Carthage falls, and with it, Alexander now controls trade routes stretching from India to Spain, the entire known world connected under one empire. What makes Alexander's empire different from every other is not just its size. It is his vision for what an empire should truly be. By approximately 300 BC in our alternate timeline, Alexander the Great rules an empire of almost unimaginable scale. From Macedonia to Egypt, he extends Greek citizenship and legal rights to the peoples he conquers, encouraging intermarriage between Greeks and the peoples of every conquered territory across the empire. The result is something the world has never seen before: a genuinely multicultural empire, where Greek law provides a framework, but local cultures flourish. One of the most profound consequences of a surviving Alexander would be the complete and total spread of Greek language and culture across the entire known world. Greek becomes the common language not just of educated elites, but of merchants, soldiers, administrators, and eventually ordinary people across the entire unified empire, a truly unified world. The result is an extraordinary intellectual explosion, a fusion of the world's greatest minds working together in one language with access to each other's knowledge for the first time. Greek philosophy, art, and science reach every corner of the known world, built upon by the brilliant minds of Persia, Egypt, India, and beyond. Perhaps the most staggering consequence of a surviving Alexander would be the extraordinary acceleration of human science and technology across the entire empire. Hero of Alexandria invented a working steam engine in the 1st century AD, but it was never developed because the ancient world had no economic incentive to replace human labor. In our alternate timeline, Alexander's vast empire creates an enormous demand in manufacturing and agriculture, providing the economic incentive to develop labor-saving technology. By the equivalent of our medieval period, and the alternate Alexander world might already be experiencing something resembling an industrial revolution. 500 years ahead of our own timeline, Judaism would almost certainly have survived in our alternate timeline. Alexander was famously respectful of the Jewish people and their traditions throughout his entire campaign. Christianity might still have emerged in our alternate timeline. But without Roman-occupied Palestine, the message would have taken a very different form entirely. The religious landscape of our alternate world would be perhaps more diverse, perhaps more tolerant, dominated by a fusion of Greek philosophy and Eastern spirituality. One of the most fascinating questions about our alternate timeline is what would have happened to the great religions that shaped our own world. Imagine a world where the Industrial Revolution happened in our equivalent medieval period, where steam power gave way to electrical power centuries earlier than our timeline. The Americas would have been discovered much earlier, perhaps by Greek or Phoenician sailors following trade routes that Alexander's empire made possible, and contact managed very differently. Imagine a world speaking one common language, evolved Greek, making communication, trade, and intellectual exchange effortless across billions of people on every continent. Would it be a perfect world? Almost certainly not. An empire of that scale would have its own corruptions, its own conflicts, and its own injustices. But it might be a world that is centuries, millennia, perhaps millennia, ahead of our own, in terms of technology, prosperity, and the realization of human potential. Alexander the Great lived for just 32 years, yet in that time, he changed the course of human history more profoundly than almost any other individual. But what our alternate has something even more profound. Alexander's greatest achievement was not his military conquests, but his extraordinary vision for humanity. Alexander had an extraordinary belief that the peoples of the world could be unified, not through fear and suppression, but through shared culture, shared law, and shared identity. In our timeline, that vision died with him in Babylon at the age of 32. His generals divided his empire, and his dream was shattered. But the seeds he planted never entirely died. Greek became the common language of the ancient Mediterranean world, the language that preserved great works of ancient knowledge. Roman law built on Greek foundations. The Library of Alexandria becoming the greatest center of learning the ancient world had ever seen. All traces of Alexander. Every time a scientist builds on a predecessor's work, every time a philosopher reasons from first principles, every time a judge applies equal law, that is Alexander's legacy. His vision of a unified human civilization, diverse in culture but united in law and reason, is still the most inspiring political vision in human history. We have not achieved it yet, but we are still trying, and perhaps that is Alexander's greatest legacy. Not the empire he built, but the dream he showed was possible. If Alexander had lived longer, would he have created a utopia or just a larger empire with the same problems? Share your thoughts below.